Okay, good evening everybody. Thank you. Very well behaved. My name is Bob O'Keefe. I'm one of the Vice Principals at Royal Holloway and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Management, Economics and Law. Now normally this lecture will be introduced by Katie Normington, who's Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Katie's been in London today at multiple events and could not make it back in time, so I'm standing in for Katie. I don't want you to think I've suddenly taken over a politics department or subject or things like that. So welcome everybody, wherever you've come from. I always particularly like to say welcome to people who've come in from outside the Holloway community, and if there's anybody who hasn't been on campus before, a particular welcome to you, and I hope you enjoy the lecture and I hope you come back for other ones. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Giacomo Benedetto, who was awarded the Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Budget Policy this year, 2016. In recent years, he has advised the European Commission and the European Parliament on different aspects of the EU's budgetary procedures. He was appointed here at Royal Holloway in 2006, having previously held a lectureship in politics at the University of Manchester. His work on the European Union's budget, the European Parliament, the British House of Commons, the constitutional politics of the EU, and on Euroscepticism has been published in international journals. He is also the co-editor of Reform of the European Union Budget, published by Palgrave in 2012, and is an associate editor of the European Journal of Government and Economics. Here at Royal Holloway, he is the Programme Director of the Interdisciplinary BA in European Studies. He teaches courses at BA and MSc level on the EU's history, theory, politics and policy. It goes without saying that this talk tonight is topical, and looking at the first slide, I'm hoping it's going to be controversial as well. So thank you, Giacomo.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Bob for your introduction. May I say, that I feel it's been a great honour to have received this title of Jean Monnet Chair, and in so doing, I want to contribute to outreach and learning as well as research within my field. And one of the things that Jean Monnet Chairs have to do is to communicate with the public and make their work known to a wider community. So within that ambit, some of the research or some of the outreach that I'll be doing will be to be organising some one-day workshops for secondary school teachers, A-level teachers in politics, on the EU, not on its budget specifically, but on the EU at a more introductory level, as well as possibly some training for civil servants, although since the referendum result was in favour of leave, there may be less demand for that. Nonetheless, in negotiating the process of Britain's exit from the European Union, there will still be a need for information. So those are some of the other activities besides more traditional research that I'll be doing. So this question of the 350 million a week was something that caught the public imagination. And what part of the weakness of the campaign for Remain was that it didn't know how to respond to this. Now, I'm not going to dispute the 350 million a week. One of the reasons why it's difficult to say that it's true or false is because when the European Union's budget is quoted in sterling, it all depends on what the exchange rate with the euro is at the time. So as we know, since June, the pound has gone down, or had gone down, against the euro by 20%. So we can see that 350 million, it could be 70 million more or less than that at any particular point. And these figures, when politicians quote figures rather than percentages of GDP, you should always be suspicious. So I'm not going to quibble with that figure, even though in some ways it's dubious. And instead, I'm going to wonder just for a moment why it was that the response to this 350 million was so weak, because the Remain campaign responded by saying that's not true, the real figure is something else, it's 230 million or it's 160 million, and there wasn't really a consensus on what the figure was, other than that 350 million was an exaggeration. Nobody at any stage attempted to actually explain not how much it was, but what it was for. What is the purpose in a multinational organisation like the European Union of having a budget in which public spending plays a role? And that, of course, was not something that the defenders of European Union membership attempted to address, as indeed they rather failed to address other controversies that arose during that campaign, and indeed for many years beforehand. So in this lecture, for the time remaining, what I want to do is go through the budget and really explain what its prospects are for the future, how it can change, and also, of course, the history and how we got to where we are today. But I would be amiss, this being a Jean Monnet lecture, if I didn't say something, first of all, about Jean Monnet and his contribution to European integration. The relationship between that and the budget will become perhaps clearer later on. After that, I'll briefly go through some figures to explain how the budget at the moment is spent and where the money for it comes from. We're always used to thinking of national contributions, but that's actually an oversimplification. So how it raises the revenue that it spends. And then consider why that's controversial. Why is there a fuss? After that, we'll look a little bit more deeply at the three areas of primary importance for spending the budget. And I'll explain what I mean by collective investment a bit later. Then there's this issue that the British first raised of net balances and rebates and getting money back. And then what kind of package deal, global agreement could be arrived at in the future? So the first thing I'll say is introduce you to Jean Monnet, who at the beginning of the 20th century, had been born in 1888, was the son and heir of a cognac business in Western France. They were wealthy people who were attempting to sell their cognac product to the British Empire, and in particular actually to North America, to the United States and to Canada. And Monnet himself, although coming from a privileged background, was quite normal at the time. He didn't go to university. He learnt his skills in the University of Life. He'd already learnt English as a boy and had come into contact with English or British merchants in cognac. But at the age of 18 took off for London and then for North America in order to sell his family's product. And in so doing, he became acquainted with the organisation of resources, logistics and shipping, and the planning of transportation of goods, and that becomes important at the time of the First World War. So, having built up a network of contacts that was impressive in North America, in New York and in Toronto, in 1914, just after the outbreak of the First World War, he, using family contacts, he manages to get an appointment with the Prime Minister of France. Well, not bad for a 26-year-old wheeler-dealer. And in this brief interview with the French Prime Minister, he convinces him of his talents for logistical organisation and organising the transportation of goods. And this is what is important about Monnet's role up until when the European communities are born in the 1950s. He's somebody who sees a collective gain in coalescing around the organisation of goods. Later on, we're talking about regulation, we're talking about something very political. In the early stages in the First World War, it's about harmonising the Allied supply lines with a common committee for organising the transportation of food and armaments to troops at the front. And it is he who is one of the key movers in transporting American-made food due to the Western Front and the Alpine Front towards the end of World War I, coalescing common supplies of resources to the troops. So that by the end of World War I, French troops on the Western Front, Italian troops on the Alpine Front are eating American tinned food. And this is due to that coalescing or commonality of integrating Allied supply lines. He's rewarded for his informal diplomatic skills. He was never in the diplomatic service, by being appointed the founding Deputy Secretary General of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, widely viewed as a failed organisation in retrospect, and Jean Monnet quits the League of Nations after 2 years in 1922 because it's clearly not delivering the sort of outcome of sharing resources between different countries that he would see as desirable. He then has a career in business and trades around the world in various forms until just after the Munich Agreement in 1938. He is sent by the French government to Washington to negotiate the acquisition of American-made aircraft. So the Munich Agreement in 1938, there's one school of thought that tells us that perhaps it did provide a benefit to Britain and France because it allowed them an extra year to rearm before the beginning of World War II. And that being the case, there was this period in Washington called Lend-Lease. The Americans were not, at that stage, selling armaments to Europeans, and in fact there was an embargo on that. So using his contacts in Capitol Hill and in the administration, he was personally acquainted with Roosevelt, he manages to negotiate a way to get around that embargo. And the way to do it is to buy all the different parts that you need for an aircraft, an aircraft for the Air Force, to buy all the different parts, have them shipped to Detroit, then they get taken over the river to Windsor, Ontario, where they're assembled. And this was his idea about getting the Americans, in a rather underhand way, to support the Allied war effort before war had actually broken out. This then continues, and it wasn't, of course, delivered in time for France to be able to resist invasion in 1940. But uniquely, this wheeler-dealer, after June 1940, becomes almost the only French citizen that the British actually trust as one of their representatives because of the network of contacts that he's built up in the United States. And in so doing, he's buying arms and involved in procurement for the British in Washington, D.C., right up until 1943. So that's the background. Somebody who in his career had, because of the situation of conflict, had been always on the, let's say, the anti-German side until 1950. Post-war, he's appointed to run the French planning department for French post-war reconstruction, and then the entire record during this period, through both world wars, is to achieve collective gain through planning and coordination and the sharing of resources. And that's a key principle of European integration since its beginning, turned over to civilian use later on. So he turns up in photographs, always slightly on the edge, important meetings. Here's a photograph taken in Algeria at a meeting that he holds, among others, with de Gaulle and Churchill. And so in 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community is launched. There's been an idea a year earlier, triggered by him and the French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, to set up a federal community, not for anything to do with economics. At that stage, it's only about coal and steel, to federalise coal and steel. Why coal and steel? Coal and steel are the two ingredients that you need to make conventional war against your neighbours. The idea is that it allows France to have some control indirectly over the extent to which Germany is able to re-industrialise and redevelop heavy industry. It allows France access also to those resources and a sharing of those resources, to actually share in in the post-war reindustrialization of Western Europe. And at the core of the coal and steel community is central planning. Also regulation and the creation of a market in coal and steel, but not ownership. This was never a socialist program. So coal and steel operatives who are privately owned would remain privately owned unless their governments chose to nationalise them, which happened in some cases. So it was about a central planning in which the private sector was also going to be involved in order to make war materially impossible between those who are participating. So what are the institutions, what are the outfits that govern this coal and steel community? Well, they're the same ones that are still in place today. The High Authority, so-called, is the predecessor of the European Commission. Its first president was Jean Monnet, and he relies on extensive technical expertise among its staff. It's a small secretariat run by experts. It's very consensual, but it's independent. Its counterpart politically is the Council, made up of ministers from the national governments. There's also a parliamentary assembly representing national parliaments, which is called the Common Assembly, which holds the High Authority to account and reads its annual report as part of a check and balance. And there's a court in case there are any legal disputes about coal and steel. This is the setup that exists in the European Union to this day. But in those days, it was a much smaller community of 6 member states. The first growth in that community didn't happen until the early 1970s, when the UK, Ireland, and Denmark joined. And this small town, rather villagey community, its first headquarters were in Luxembourg, in this turn-of-the-century building with a rather endearing clock tower. But that's not to underestimate the contribution, at least felt by John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was just one of the presidents of the US that Jean Monnet interacted with, and Kennedy paid tribute to Jean Monnet by saying to him that under his inspiration, Europe has moved closer to unity in less than 20 years than it had done before in 1,000, or transforming Europe by the power of a constructive idea. So having introduced something of the work of the man after which this particular academic chair is named, and emphasised the part of his work which is looking at the sharing of resources for common gain. I've talked about collective goods or collective advantages. What I mean by that is that you gain more from pooling whatever it is, your coal and steel or your sovereignty, than you lose. So in terms of cost versus benefit, sometimes there will be costs, but the benefits on the whole are greater in providing economies of scale and so on, as well at the time, of course, as a guarantee of peace. So what is the budget of the European Union for? Is it to finance redistribution from, let's say, the wealthy to the poor? Is it in some way to compensate those who lose from European integration? Is European integration always a win-win for everyone? If it's not, should you give some kind of compensation to the losers? Or is it there not to finance winners and losers, but to provide collective benefits, or what economists call public goods, which are the things that I talked about before, whether it's there being more benefits than there are costs, or whether some of those benefits in some sense can't be quantified, because if this is something that guarantees you peace rather than war, that's an unquantifiable benefit. But that notion of public goods or collective benefits is at the core of what, certainly of Jean Monnet's view of European integration. So the way the budget works now, which is what I'm just about to explain, is that there are different policies, and the most famous spending policy is the agricultural policy. And the subjects that they're spent on, the first heading the one which is most about collective gains, is what's called competitiveness. That's all of the funds that go on research and innovation, the provision of high-tech infrastructure, and so on, including satellites, space exploration, and so on. The idea of the competitiveness spending is it's not about redistribution, it's about collective gains. And then there's cohesion, that's also known as regional development, whereby the poorer regions of Europe get priority funding. It's more explicitly redistributional. It's about transferring resources to the less prosperous. And then there's agriculture. And tacked onto agriculture are a couple of smaller funds that deal with rural development, fisheries, and environmental spending. But most of that part of the budget is about direct income, or if you want to be a little more cynical, welfare payments to landowners. And then there's a very small spend on security and justice matters, on foreign affairs, and on administration. The administration budget's about 6%. Now, these budgets are worked out for 7-year periods, and the total amount we're talking of is about 1% of national wealth. So usually governments in Western Europe are spending 45%, or somewhere between 40 and 50% of national wealth in terms of tax and spend. The EU accounts for just 1/40 of that. And the spending periods, they're a bit like multiple year plans, 5-year plans and so on. They're 7 years long. There was one that finished in 2013 and the current one will run until 2020. Within those limits, annual budgets are passed. And then the next question is, okay, well that's how the money's spent, but where does the money actually come from? That's the revenue side. And so having listed what all of those policies actually are, just to show you some numbers. So this is in the last period that ended in 2013. We see that the total spend is 1% of national wealth, which in figures at the time were 972 billion euro. For the 2014 to 2020 period, the European Commission proposed to freeze that amount. Keep it at 1%, keep this figure the same. And David Cameron, he was the front man for this, he wasn't the only one. David Cameron and his allies in the Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark wanted a cut. They wanted to come back to their countries, particularly David Cameron, and said, I've cut the budget. And he succeeded. The budget went down by 5%. To 908. So what actually happened in terms of how much money all of these programs got? As you can see, in the last period, the amount for all of that research and innovation, all the good and interesting stuff that interests us in universities, which also includes Erasmus, that was only 9% of the spend. So regional development was 36%, agricultural direct payments to farmers was 34%, so they're about the same. So the Commission was ambitious in trying to get this amount here to go up for competitiveness, for research and everything, and had entered a proposed cut of about 10% each on cohesion and on agriculture. But at the end of the day, when Cameron and his allies succeeded in getting the budget reduced, who was it that paid the price in order to deliver that 5% cut? It wasn't cohesion, and it wasn't agriculture as much as it was competitiveness, the investment in research, innovation, technology, and education. Because that was a much softer area of spending to attack. And this happens also year on year. So every year an annual budget is passed, and every year the part of spending that comes under pressure in order to sustain spending on redistribution, whether it's to poorer regions or to the farming sector, the part of the budget that feels the heat is the competitiveness, research and innovation part of the budget. So then to look at specifically competitiveness, this is what gets spent. So what does competitiveness mean? Well, by far the biggest part of it, over half of it, is Horizon 2020. Which in 2015 was worth 9.6 billion. The other parts of this area of competitiveness are also, many of them, research-based, but focusing on matters like the satellite program, 837 million, the nuclear fusion program, the space and Earth observation program, which is called Copernicus, more nuclear research, but that's not fusion, that's conventional nuclear, and then education here, 1.8 billion, which includes Erasmus. Connecting Europe is about energy security, pipelines, energy networks, high-speed broadband, and so on. That was at the start of its spending cycle. And what we see when we look at the total amount is that, as you may remember, I talked about this being 13% for these 7 years. Actually, in 2015, it was less than that. It was below 12%. That aside, the UK does relatively well in spending for Horizon 2020 and on nuclear research. In fact, they're almost the only areas where the UK does well proportionately, if we're looking at what's the direct UK benefit. Regional development, I'll say less about this. Most of it's going on the less developed regions. There's a small amount that's going on youth employment and training, but otherwise it's about economic transfers to regions where the level of average wealth is low. But once again, compared to what the governments had agreed, originally 34%, here this policy of redistribution does better. So it's again competitiveness that feels the heat, while redistribution to regions does well. The same happens in agriculture. In agriculture, the difference between what the governments had agreed and what gets spent in the end is 2% to the benefit of agriculture. And the agricultural bill is almost 45 billion euro just in 1 year, with rather less being spent on these other areas within the policy framework, notably only 341 million being spent in environment and climate change. And then we have some other headings which are worth really very little. Within this one, which is called Security and Citizenship, which would also be there to finance sort of databases like the Schengen Information System and cooperation on matters to do with the Schengen area and asylum and immigration. Well, the total EU spend from the EU budget on asylum and immigration in 2015, which was at the height of the refugee crisis, was €413. Now, a lot more of that was being spent in the central Mediterranean and in the Balkans. But the money being spent was money that national governments were essentially donating from national budgets. The British Navy and British Coast Guard, for example, have volunteered ships to work in the Mediterranean to deal with the migration flows, and that has been offered out of the generosity of the budget of the British government, as well as by other governments who've done similar things. It hasn't come from the EU budget. So the EU is responsible for a Schengen area, for removing internal borders, for having an asylum and immigration policy, but the amount of money that national governments will release to the EU as EU funds is only €413 million in the year which represented the height of the crisis. It was increased actually for 2016, but only by 50%. That sounds like a lot, but it went up to about €600 million. So I'll just pause there. That's how it's spent. What about where the money comes from? So I won't talk too much about what the British contribution is, but globally, about 1/8 of the money for the EU budget comes from VAT. So each country contributes a proportion of its VAT receipts to the EU budget. Another 1/8 or so, 12.7%, comes from the EU's external tariff. So when goods come in from outside the EU, and the biggest place where that happens is Rotterdam, But in the UK, it would be Southampton or Felixstowe, if we're thinking of ships full of goods coming from China. Well, when they get unloaded, they get taxed, and that tax gets passed on to the EU as the external tariff. So that's about an eighth. But the rest of it, 3/4 of it, it's actually a little bit more than this 69%, is based on national income. So everyone contributes a proportion of their national income that is, in terms of percentages, is equal across all of Europe to make up the difference, so that you get that final 1% of national income making up the budget. There are also some very small and historic sources of income, like this very minuscule one for sugar. Sugar gets an EU tax put on it. So in 2015, the EU's total expenditure was 145 billion, which is 1% of national income. GNI stands for gross national income. In the UK, 7.5 billion was spent, which amounts to just 0.3% of national income. So that would be £3 in every 1,000. So £3 with every 1,000 that are spent or are present in the UK economy is money coming from the European Union budget. The total revenue is, you'll be happy to notice that there's a tiny surplus being run by the EU's budget. The total revenue was 1 billion more than the spend. But the revenue from the UK was 0.85. And what this shows us is an interesting fact. Because of the British rebate, the British discount, the Brits, of course, are relatively under-receiving if we look at these two figures. But if you look at these two figures, the Brits are also relatively under-contributing as a proportion of their national wealth. And there are many member states that are considerably poorer than the UK in the European Union. So the average, I've said this before, the average tax and spend is about 45%. In Britain, it's gone down to 40%. In Denmark or France, it's well in excess of 50%. So on average, we're talking about something like 2% of public spending. So for every £100 of public spending, 2 of those 100 come from the EU budget, or are going to the EU budget. So it doesn't look like it's very much. The EU brings with us some advantages. Why does it matter? Why is this 2% so controversial? Well, I'd say firstly it's because most people don't realise that it's only 2%. And I don't want to flummox you with figures any longer, because that's what ends up getting bandied around in the media, and it turns people off. So why does it really matter? If you go back historically, and this is where I'll go back almost to the time of Jean Monnet, not quite as far as him, but back to the 1960s, the creation of the Common Agricultural Policy. Back in the 1960s, a lot of European agriculture was still unmechanised. Here you see oxen pulling a plough. And we had a situation in Europe where post-war there'd been food shortages. There was real hunger, particularly in the late 1940s in Germany, insufficient food supply, an agriculture that even if everybody had returned to farms as they'd been in pre-war, an agriculture that wasn't producing for the population size and wasn't guaranteeing security of food supply to people living in cities. And what we see then with the agricultural policy is a policy which is designed to deal with food shortages. In Britain alone, there was rationing of food until the 1950s. Well, I think until 1954. People who were alive at that stage still remember powdered eggs. And so that was a reality very much within the living memory of people even today. The other problem was urbanisation. So there was reindustrialisation, particularly in France and Italy, in the 1950s and 1960s. people moving from the country to the cities very fast, causing social instability. And so one of the objectives was to slow down the urban flight and create a living in the countryside. How did you do that in the 1950s and 60s? Through agriculture. There wasn't teleworking, there wasn't rural tourism in those days. How you made a living in the countryside in the 1960s was still through agriculture. And so it was addressing the needs of the time. But it was also a compensation, what we call a side payment, for that part of the population, rural communities, that are less likely to support European integration, that are weaker if there is integration of markets without compensation. So there was always an element of it that we could say cynically was a payoff. So it achieves consent for economic integration. But the mistake of Jean Monnet's immediate successors was, and I'm sure it was a mistake that he supported himself at the time. There's no reason to suppose otherwise. Hindsight is all very beautiful. These subsidies for agriculture were made permanent. You couldn't easily get rid of them once they were put in place. And later spending policies were not put together in the same way. So agricultural spending today is still pre-allocated to countries. That's legally required that those payments are made. And each country gets a certain chunk of funds. And those funds are paid in full. No one locally has to put up any money as well. And change is possible, but it's easy to block, because to make a change you need to have a majority of the member states voting for the change, and there are always enough member states to block what is called a qualified majority. So to make these sorts of changes you need about 3/4 of the countries, about 21 out of 28. And there are always going to be at least 7 or 8, not just France, but some other countries as well, that will block that change to agricultural, to the status of agriculture. So it's easy to prevent a change. And it was there, put in place and made permanent in 1970 as part of a package deal. And I want to say something about package deals as we go on. So the package deal of 1970 was one where France, up until 1970, the agricultural policy was approved every year. And then in 1970 it was made permanent. And the package deal was that France wanted that permanency for agricultural funding. And the other countries, at that stage there were 5 of them, granted that to France on condition for some European Parliament control over the budget, but that was of perhaps a minor consideration at the time. The big price that France wanted to extract, or rather to concede, was French acceptance of UK membership. So the French knew very well that the British would not want the common agricultural policy as they were envisioning it. The French, until then, were not allowing Britain to join. And the big deal in 1970 was that France said to Germany and the others, we'll let Britain in, but you have to give us permanent financing for agriculture. So there was always give and take. Now, why have I got the Archbishop of Canterbury and a QWERTY keyboard up there at this time? Well, why are there bishops in the House of Lords? Tony Blair, when he was in power, there was a proposal to reform and democratise the House of Lords, and one of the suggestions was to remove the bishops in the House of Lords. Seems a bit old-fashioned. Why are bishops inside our legislature just because they're bishops? Tony Blair thought that the bishops should stay because it's important that the voice of faith be represented. But the reason that the bishops are present in the House of Lords is a medieval reason. Back in the 13th or 14th century, medieval kings of England didn't include bishops in the House of Lords because they thought that the voice of faith should be represented. The reason was that the church was the country's biggest landowner and would contribute to the personnel and resources for the king to raise an army. And so it was essential for them as political magnates and economic magnates to be inside the legislature. Well, that was a decision taken, let's say, in the 1300s, and it's still with us. The QWERTY keyboard is an invention of the 19th century, when the typewriter was invented, And then perhaps the location of the keys are not, with hindsight, the most logical or the most obvious. And we all, when we learn to type for the first time, as two-finger typists, learn to find our way around that keyboard and where the letters are. But once the first generation of typists had learned to use a typewriter, they would always resist any change to the QWERTY keyboard. It became entrenched. And that's the point of the Common Agricultural Policy. Not only of that, but also this method for making policy. So the same European community that produces the CAP which I've shown this left-hand picture before, this technocratic, consensual, committee-based institution from 1953. And here is one of their first meetings, chaired by Jean Monnet. Remains a technocratic, consensual, and committee-based institution to this day, with a staff of at most 23,000, of whom a third are translators and interpreters, and a budget of only 1% of national wealth, that is unable to effectively respond to the crises and challenges of the contemporary world. And I've used agriculture to give an example of just how it got entrenched. But I'm going to say something now just about cohesion and development. There was some learning, and the regional development policy started in the 1970s. It got doubled at the end of the 1980s. And like agriculture, each country gets a pre-allocated amount of money. But unlike agriculture, all of the recipients, all of the local governments that get this money need to prove that they're putting up some of the money themselves. So they have buy-in to the projects, and it reduces the spend. And all of the programs for regional development have to be renewed by European law every 7 years. And so because a renewal by law is needed, potentially these projects could be blocked. And that is absolutely not the case with agriculture. It's a consequence of perhaps learning from the disadvantage of the way in which agricultural spending was put up. In 1988, when the regional development policy was doubled in size, there was a package deal. I've mentioned those before. The package was agreement of the Single European Act, compensating the less prosperous regions, particularly in Spain and Portugal that had just joined, and allowing them to develop their economy so they could compete within the single market, a market that was going to get bigger and bigger. Then we're back to research and innovation. This isn't about redistribution, it's about collective benefits. It's not pre-allocated, funds must be matched, so local partners, recipients have to put up some of the money. The spending isn't compulsory, it can be withdrawn. It lasts for a particular time period, and then the programs have to be renewed. I'll give you an example. Horizon 2020 used to be called the 7th Framework Programme. So sometimes the programs change their name. They don't only change their name, they change their priorities, their structures, and so on. They have to be approved, and they only last for 7 years at a time. But it's the part of spending that's most under pressure. And it includes these areas of which I've talked before. Including, if we're looking at the collective benefits, they earned 413 million on asylum and immigration last year. So why can't these public goods grow? Why are they always under pressure? And the answer, very simply, goes back to Margaret Thatcher and the agreement on the British rebate at Fontainebleau. So back in 1984, it was a summit that took place just outside Paris. The British had been complaining about justified iniquity in spending. They weren't benefiting from the EU budget as much as others, and they thought they were paying in too much. And she secured a mechanism to compensate Britain for that. And in those negotiations, the European Parliament and the European Commission proposed that, yes, we could have a rebate, but let's just have it for 3 years. Or perhaps instead of a rebate, we could just spend more money in the UK, change the CAP, introduce some new policy so that more money is spent in Britain. And Thatcher said no to both of these proposals. Perhaps the European Parliament and the European Commission would have won if instead of wanting a 3-year temporary rebate, they said, let's have one for 10 or 15 years. Maybe the British would have accepted that. But Margaret Thatcher walked away with a permanent agreement on a British discount. But she also conceded. What is it that she gave away in order to get that? So every time somebody's giving something away, there's an exchange. The budget, there's a decision, it's linked to a decision to raise the EU budget. The budget will get bigger, and the British accept that as the price for their rebate. The VAT, the amount of VAT that goes into it will go up. Agriculture will remain unchanged. There was a clear link between that policy and the British rebate. And finally, the British at the time were threatening to veto the membership of Spain and Portugal, which joined 2 years later, and they relinquished that. So just as de Gaulle, just as Pompidou, the president of France, allowed the UK in the 1970s in exchange for the permanent financing of agriculture, the Brits allowed in Spain and Portugal in exchange for getting their rebate. But unforeseen consequences. Later on, the UK becomes more prosperous. It was a relatively poor member state in 1984. And because of world trade agreements, the EU, the Europeans, have to reduce agricultural subsidies. So there's a big cut in agricultural spending after 1992. And that removes some of the justification for the British rebate. But the British rebate remains, and instead, the Germans, the Danes, the Dutch, the Austrians and the Swedes all demand more compensation. They all want to get smaller rebates. They say, Britain's now rich, we're, at the same level as us, they're getting a big discount, why aren't we getting one? So they all get little rebates. Sometimes it's a lump sum, a fixed sum of cash. Some countries are paying only half as much VAT as the others are. And the Germans get what's called a rebate on the rebate. The contribution that they have to make to the British rebate is reduced. So there are, besides the British rebate, 3 other types of rebate system, making this extremely complicated every time there's a reform. And it leads, the fact that these other countries have started to get rebates means that those who don't are then ever more fixated by the net balance. So France doesn't get a rebate, nor does Italy, nor does Belgium, which are relatively prosperous countries, and they're always looking at what they're getting and what they're contributing. So everyone is fixated by the net balance. And yet it's only 2% of public spending. And this seems crazy. We have the United Nations and NATO, but no one's asking for rebates from those budgets. The United Nations programs are quite expensive. It's taken for granted. Could it be that the controversy is that the EU's budget, although it's only 2% of public spending, is what allows the EU to be more than just a free trade area? And that in itself is controversial. And yet, if you'd not had that 2% of public spending, would the common market have actually been possible? If French farmers had not somehow been bought into the process with subsidy, would French public opinion have accepted that common market? And later, thinking of Spain, Portugal, Greece, would those countries have accepted the single market, removing all sorts of protections, unless they'd been compensated with budget spending? So I'm going to wrap up and show just the outline of what the future could look like. What Europe needs is a budget that can solve problems rather than cause them, or help Europe to be a salvation for problems and challenges. There's so much division and lack of trust between European-level politicians from different countries that these budget disputes, based on national figures and so on, are very, very costly economically and politically. So a very simple proposal is that the budget of the EU should follow policy, and agriculture is part of that. Not just because farmers will resist withdrawal of subsidies, but we have potentially, with climate change, a food security crisis. So it's a question not necessarily of cutting agricultural spending. There isn't national level subsidy systems for agriculture, incidentally. All of the subsidy system, the main part of it, is coming from the European level. So guaranteeing food security. Dealing with climate change, not just trying to cut emissions, but accepting that perhaps some climate change, at the very least, is irreversible and that we need to adapt to that challenge. For example, with flood defences and other infrastructure. And then, of course, the traditional market integration, for which it's helpful to support competitiveness and investment. So these are the areas where the money should be spent more clearly. And the revenue, where the money actually comes from, rather than being from those national contributions, could be part of those policies as well. So if we're concerned about climate change, we can consider carbon taxes on the coal sector and on carbon-intensive energies. We're concerned about tax avoidance by multinational corporations like Apple and Amazon, a common corporation income tax for transnational companies can be considered, and previously tax on financial transactions was in the offing. The idea then is, next thing is to challenge the net balances. So of course Brexit eliminates the biggest defender of rebates and net balances. But it doesn't solve the problem if the UK leaves. The EU budget is spent on different sorts of policy. Agriculture. On agriculture, if you're a French farmer who produces cheese and you get your payment, does that payment count really as a payment only to France? What about the consumers outside France who might consume French cheese? Are they beneficiaries of that expenditure? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Agriculture is the most national part of EU budget spending. So if anyone was getting a national receipt from agricultural spending, or from spending, it would be from agriculture. The other areas, it's less certain. Let's take research. Let's say that the Horizon 2020 is financing a research project into cancer and cures for cancer. And let's say that it's coordinated by a medical school in London. That school is the leader of the consortium, but the consortium is multinational. There will be researchers based in other EU countries. But the money will go through a bank account in London, and for the purposes of accounting, counts as a payment to the UK. And yet the money could be being spent around Europe. If patients eventually are treated and recover from illness, the patients, wherever they're located, are going to be beneficiaries, as are pharmaceutical companies that might be manufacturing the drugs. And then, of course, there's the big collective benefit. It's not just a welfare payment if we're talking about research. It's the benefit of the research itself, quite apart from who actually gets the money. Connecting Europe is the policy for transport infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And this is an interesting tweet from last week. I kid you not, says this Welsh member of the Welsh Assembly, whose name I can't pronounce. UKIP Assembly member has just asked if the Welsh Government could ask Ireland to pay for a new M4 because Ireland could access EU funds. Oh yes. It's not so illogical, actually, because if the M4 is improved using EU funds and is extended as far as Fishguard in the southwest of Wales, that money would count as a receipt by the United Kingdom. But who benefits? Yes, some people in Wales may benefit. But perhaps if you're looking at which country benefits more, it's going to be Ireland, whose road connections with the rest of Europe are then improved. So is that a payment to the UK, or is it a payment also to Ireland if, for example, the M4 improvements were subsidised by European grants? So that's from the EU budget to show, in a sense, how that's illogical. But in fact, collective spending at the EU level, besides the EU budget, is worth actually 3 times as much as the EU budget itself, something closer to 3% of national income. Because there are several funds for investing in infrastructure, training and research and development that are run by the national governments collectively, sometimes financed by the private sector. The private sector is putting in 100 billion a year into the European Fund for Strategic Investments. It's underwritten by the national governments. So if an investment goes belly up and fails, the national governments pick up the bill. But the private sector is putting the money up. It's a bit like private-public partnership. And the value of these funds, coordinated at European level, adds up, together with the EU budget, it's something like 3 times more than the EU budget itself. The stability mechanism is the bailout mechanism used for distressed countries. That's worth 705 billion, all of which are coordinated by the EU, but not by the European Commission. And the problem is that these funds that I've just mentioned are run by the governments in a rather secretive way, and it's a lot less accountable than the way in which the EU's formal budget is run. So with that, I think it's persuasive enough to challenge this notion of net balances. And then you need to come to a budget that can respond to unforeseen events. We didn't see the Eurozone crisis coming, nor the migration crisis. That hit Europe unexpectedly, without the resources to cope and manage with those crises. In the future, we could see food security crises, given the gravity of climate change. And other parts of adaptation to the climate challenge, like flood defences. Then there's traditional investment in economic growth, quite apart from response to crisis. Training, research and infrastructure, of which I've talked a lot. And then solidarity for the least prosperous regions. Those very poor parts of Greece and Bulgaria, where there is a justified need for redistribution. But there, the investment should be less on the infrastructure and redistribution, which they've been receiving for a long time, and more on investing, on improving their administrations, making them less liable to corruption, improving the judiciary, because having an inefficient judiciary is one of the key factors that undermines an economy. If the private sector won't invest in a place if they don't have a guarantee that legal disputes can be solved. And of course, collecting taxes, which has been a big problem in Greece. So those are the challenges that some of the less prosperous parts of Europe face. The treaty, this is almost the last slide, the treaty states that the EU will be financed entirely through its own resources. And yet, with national contributions making up 3/4 of the money, it's not really financed through its own resources. VAT is an own resource, and tariffs are an own resource. So right now, there's a group of 10 wise persons that includes some women, which is drawing up only 2 actually. The other 8 are men. The others are, which is drawing up a plan for changing the revenue base for the EU budget. It's due to publish its report next month. There'd been a conference made up of national parliamentarians in September in Brussels that deliberated on those proposals as they were being drafted. All the national parliaments had the chance to send delegates. The only one that came from Westminster was from the Scottish National Party, which tells you something about the interest in future European developments within British politics. It's not unreasonable considering that the UK is leaving and perhaps that Scotland doesn't wish to. The key issue, actually I think is most interesting, is the use of tax to influence behaviour, and that's where it fits in with other parts of EU policy. So national taxes have always been raising revenue and influencing behaviour. We have taxes on tobacco and alcohol to try to discourage their use. At the same time, they raise money. Why can't the EU do the same kind of thing, notably in terms of issues such as carbon? That's a picture of the assembly that met in September on the finances of the EU. So an objective is to reduce the weight of national contributions once you've destroyed the idea that net balances and how much money each country gets, pays in and gets out, have any meaning at all, which I argue they don't. In line with the Paris agreements on climate change, a carbon tax could be considered. In view of the various scandals involving Amazon and Apple, there is a case for a transnational corporation tax, and what we need to recognise is that whereas your neighbourhood small bookshop pays taxes, Amazon doesn't. So there is a very strong case to resolve what amounts to a distortion of competition. How can your small business compete against big multinational businesses when the small businesses pay tax and the big multinationals don't? One way of doing that is by introducing an EU-level tax on the incomes or revenues of big multinational corporations. Financial transactions tax has been, or otherwise known as the Tobin tax, has been dismissed. Although it's popular in some countries like France, the conclusion is that it's too complicated technically to collect. So there's some technical considerations there. The opposite applies to VAT. Somebody has suggested a real EU VAT on top of national VAT. You'd have it on your receipt, 20% VAT UK, 1% VAT EU. That's been dismissed. Although technically it would be very easy to collect, it would be too unpopular. So in moving towards forms of revenue like the carbon tax, what's really exciting is trying to think of ways in which you could get the most reluctant countries to accept them. And if you're talking about taxing coal, we're thinking primarily of Poland and the Czech Republic. Under what circumstances could those governments, and Polish government in particular, at the moment is run by a political party that contains many climate change deniers. The proposal to really make it work is to organise a rebate, but not one like the British one. This would be that if a country with a big coal sector ends up paying a carbon tax, or rather its coal users end up paying a carbon tax, coal producers, which is bigger than, say, 1% of its national wealth, you give them a rebate, not on a net balance, but on their gross balance. So regardless of EU expenditure on other policies in that country, you give them a rebate on the gross amount, and with it, one string attached that they can't use it to cross-subsidise carbon industry. So this is one of the proposals that we were working on. Then aviation as part of the carbon tax also comes into the equation. There's many environmental groups say that aviation should be taxed based on air miles. And yes, that could be an option to introduce more radical taxation in order to discourage short-haul flights. In a sense, what's the justification of being able to fly between London and Paris, or Paris and Frankfurt? Where you would need rebates or exemptions is when you come to countries that are geographically isolated, often by sea. Malta, Greece, Cyprus, and also Ireland, while we're thinking about it. You couldn't really operate an aviation tax on them in the same way as you would, let's say, on flights between France and Germany. So there are many issues to resolve, but these are some of the issues on the agenda. And to finish, It was Jean Monnet who said, and I think this is prescient given the crises that Europe faces, Brexit, the migration crisis, potentially climate crisis, and of course the Eurozone, that the greatest risk of all would be to do nothing and change nothing. So I will wind up there.